I bought the place because it felt like a reset button. A narrow country road, a curtain of pine and oak, and a stretch of land that rolled out behind the house like someone had unspooled a green carpet just for me. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't trendy, it was solid, quiet, and old in the best way, with a porch that creaked under honest weight and a gravel drive that crunched like it was applauding every time I came home. After years of noise, meetings, and people who thought their opinions were the same as facts, I wanted space. I wanted boundaries that made sense. I wanted to live somewhere I could breathe. The listing had called it a semi-rural gem and mentioned a neighborhood association in the same breath as community charm. That part didn't bother me at first. Around here, everything had some kind of committee attached to it. But the first clue that this association wasn't normal came before I'd even finished unpacking. A thick envelope showed up in my mailbox the morning after I moved in, stuffed with laminated standards, color charts, approved mailbox styles, and a welcome packet that somehow managed to feel like a warning. It was the kind of paperwork that wasn't meant to help you fit in, but to remind you you were being watched. Still, I'm not the kind of person who starts a war over paper. I read it. I filed it. I figured if I kept my yard clean, paid whatever fees were required, and didn't park a rusted boat on cinder blocks out front, nobody would have a reason to care what I did. That was my mistake. People like this don't need a reason. They only need time. The land had an odd shape, like the original surveyor had traced it around something important instead of cutting clean lines. There was my main lot, the house, and then a long strip that ran down toward the back tree line. At the far edge, past where the grass turned to brush and the brush turned to woods, there was a worn path. Not a road, exactly. More like a flattened ribbon of dirt with grass growing thin in the middle, the kind that happens when tires have rolled the same route for decades. It led toward a set of older parcels beyond the neighborhood, properties that had been there long before the association ever existed. The previous owner had mentioned it in passing during the walk. Through the way someone talks about a scar they've had so long they forget it's there. He'd called it an access lane and said it had been used forever. He also said the association pretended it didn't exist, which sounded like a petty dispute I didn't want to inherit. I assumed it was one of those neighborhood quirks, a low-level irritation that never rose above grumbling at the mailbox. 2 days after the move, I saw the first sign that it was a lot more than that. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting gold through the trees, when a pickup I didn't recognize rolled slowly along that back path. The driver didn't come near my house. He kept to the far edge, tires bumping over roots, moving with the kind of confidence you only have when you've driven the same route 100 times. He disappeared into the woods at the back corner, and the sound faded, swallowed by leaves. I didn't chase him down. I didn't wave him over. I just stood on my porch, watching. The lane was on my land, at least according to the deed I'd signed, but the lane also looked older than my house, older than the subdivision, older than the neat fences and matching mailboxes and tidy little rules. I made a mental note to check my closing documents later. That evening, I walked the property line with a flashlight and the survey stakes the inspector had pointed out. The stakes confirmed what my eyes already suspected. The lane ran along a portion of my lot like a crease, a thing that didn't belong to the modern layout but had been absorbed into it anyway. Along the edge, the ground was packed harder. In one spot, half buried in dirt and leaves, I found a rusted metal marker. It looked like a survey pin or an old boundary sign, the kind you'd only notice if you were looking for it. It wasn't until the next morning that the neighborhood's real personality introduced itself properly. A white SUV pulled into my drive like it owned the gravel. It didn't stop politely at the end the way visitors do. It came all the way up near the house, close enough that I could see the spotless paint and the little community compliance decal on the back window. The engine didn't even shut off at first, like whoever was inside was timing how long it took me to appear. I stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, still half in my moving day fatigue. The driver's door opened and out came a woman who moved like she'd practiced being offended in the mirror. She was dressed too clean for a morning visit, hair set perfectly, sunglasses perched like armor. She carried a folder pressed tight against her chest, as if it contained the only truth that mattered. She didn't smile. She scanned my porch, my boots, the moving boxes still visible through the doorway, and then her gaze drifted past me toward the back of my property, like she was already inspecting it for crimes. Her posture said she wasn't here to meet me, she was here to correct me. I didn't invite her in. I didn't need to hear words to understand what she represented. There are people who walk into your life with a checklist and a hunger for control, and they always pick the same targets: newcomers, outsiders, anyone who doesn't already know the rules of their little kingdom. She started flipping through her folder with quick, sharp motions. Papers rustled, tabs flashed. She pointed once toward the side yard, then toward the street, then toward the back, as if my entire property was already a problem she'd been assigned to solve. Her attention kept snapping to the tree line, to that old lane, like it bothered her that it existed at all. I held my coffee and let the silence stretch. In my head, I was already deciding how to handle this without letting it become my new hobby. I dealt with corporate bullies and petty managers and people who mistook volume for authority. The playbook never changed. If you reacted, they won. If you apologized, they smelled blood. If you argued, they got entertainment. The only thing that worked was calm, firm boundaries. She finally walked off the drive without waiting for any kind of permission, heels crunching gravel, heading toward the side of my house like she planned to inspect the backyard personally. That was the moment my patience clicked into place. Not anger, not fear, just clarity. This wasn't a friendly neighbor. This was someone used to pushing until other people stepped aside. I moved off the porch and followed at a measured pace, keeping distance, watching how she navigated my property like it was already hers. She reached the point where the grass started to thin, where the ground dipped slightly toward the lane, and she stopped. Her head turned sharply as if she'd heard something. From the woods, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of another vehicle, tires on packed dirt, a low engine hum. The lane was being used again. The woman stiffened, and even from behind I could see the way her shoulders rose, the way her whole body tightened like a dog hearing an intruder. She spun toward the tree line and then back toward me, the folder clutched so hard the edges bent. Her face was set in a kind of certainty that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with obsession. Whatever she believed about that lane, whatever story she'd told herself and anyone who would listen, it wasn't just a preference. It was a mission, and as the sound grew closer, she stepped forward, not away, as if she intended to confront it with her own body. I watched the old path, the place where the trees opened like a doorway, and I felt something shift in the air. This wasn't going to be about paint colors or mailbox heights. This was about control, territory, and a line in the dirt that someone wanted erased, and I had the sinking suspicion that she thought she could erase it by force. The vehicle never fully emerged from the trees that morning. It slowed, hesitated, and then backed away, retreating down the old lane as if whatever was waiting at the edge of the property wasn't worth the trouble. The sound faded, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. The woman stood frozen for a moment, staring into the woods like she had just watched something defy her will. When she turned back toward me, the expression on her face wasn't relief. It was offense, the kind that calcifies into something dangerous when it goes unchallenged for too long. She began pacing the edge of the grass, gesturing sharply toward the ground. The trees, the invisible line she clearly believed, existed only because she said so. The folder in her hands opened and closed, papers flashing in the sun like credentials meant to intimidate. Even without words, her intent was obvious. She was asserting ownership over a space that did not emotionally belong to her, relying on laminated rules and her own volume of confidence to make reality bend. I stayed where I was, hands relaxed, posture neutral. Years of experience had taught me that escalation feeds on reaction. She wanted pushback. She wanted anger. She wanted me to become a character in a story where she was the hero enforcing order. I refused to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I watched the way her eyes kept flicking back to the lane, to the packed dirt, to the fact that someone else's life intersected her vision of control. Eventually, she stormed back toward the driveway, heels digging into gravel with theatrical purpose. The SUV door slammed hard enough to rattle the mirrors, and the vehicle tore off down the road, leaving a cloud of dust and the unmistakable feeling that this was far from over. The quiet that followed wasn't peaceful. It was anticipatory. By noon, the first notice appeared, not in my mailbox, but taped to my front door like a scarlet letter. Bright paper, bold lettering. Multiple violations cited in dense, aggressive formatting. Unauthorized use of common land, unapproved access paths, safety hazards. The language was vague enough to be flexible and threatening enough to feel absolute. It cited fines, enforcement actions, and further measures if noncompliance continued. The implication was clear: comply now or be punished later. I peeled it off, folded it once, and set it on the kitchen counter next to the welcome packet. The contrast was almost funny. One promised community. The other promised consequences. Both assumed obedience. That afternoon, I pulled out my closing documents, deeds, plats, addendums. The paperwork every homeowner signs without truly reading because it's thick and boring and supposed to be handled by professionals. I had learned long ago that boring paperwork is where real power hides. Contracts outlast people. Ink outlives outrage. The survey confirmed the boundaries I'd already walked. The lane sat fully within my property lines, though it hugged the edge in a way that made it easy for anyone to pretend it was something else. There was a notation in smaller print, an asterisk next to a line that ran along that strip. It referenced an easement, no details, just a reference number and a date that stopped me cold. 1923, nearly 100 years old, long before this neighborhood, long before the association, long before anyone currently involved had been born. I felt that slow, familiar tightening in my chest, not fear but focus. Old easements don't disappear just because someone doesn't like them. They survive subdivisions, rezonings, committees, and power trips. They are ghosts in the land records, and when you know how to read them, they can resurrect themselves in spectacular ways. I spent the next 2 days doing nothing visible, no changes to the property, no calls to the association, no confrontations. From the outside, it probably looked like compliance. That illusion didn't last long. The notices escalated quickly. 1 became 3, then 5. Each more urgent than the last, each citing the same alleged violations with increasingly dramatic language. They started arriving certified, the kind that requires a signature so there's proof you received the threat. Fines were added retroactively, as if punishment could be manufactured out of thin air. The numbers grew fast enough to feel intentional, like pressure being applied in calculated bursts. Neighbors began to watch. Curtains shifted. Garage doors paused halfway open. When I walked to the mailbox, I could feel eyes on my back. This was entertainment now, a spectacle. The association versus the newcomer. The woman in the SUV versus the quiet guy on the edge of the neighborhood. People like her thrive on that audience. It validates the performance. Then came the physical markers. Small orange flags appeared overnight along the edge of the lane, staked into the ground with sharp angles, marching like little soldiers toward the woods. A laminated sign followed, zip, tied to a wooden post: no trespassing, HOA controlled property, unauthorized access prohibited. It was placed squarely on my land. That was the moment annoyance hardened into resolve. Paper threats were one thing, stakes in the ground were another. This wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about someone attempting to overwrite history with plastic signs and misplaced authority. I removed nothing. I touched nothing. Instead, I documented everything. Photographs from multiple angles, dates, times, GPS coordinates, the flags, the sign, the path itself. I captured the packed earth, the wear patterns, the way grass refused to reclaim it because it had been traveled for generations. Evidence doesn't need emotion. It just needs consistency. On the third evening, just before sunset, I saw her again. She didn't come alone this time. 2 other vehicles followed the white SUV, both bearing the same decal. A small convoy of self-importance rolled onto my driveway without hesitation. They didn't park neatly. They fanned out like they were securing a scene. The The woman moved faster now, energized, emboldened by witnesses. Her gestures were sharper, her posture more aggressive. She marched toward the back, toward the lane, toward the thing she couldn't tolerate existing. One of the others carried a clipboard. Another held a phone up, already recording, already framing a narrative where enforcement would look justified. I stood at the edge of my porch, watching the performance unfold on my property. I could see it in her body language, the way she leaned forward, the way her hands clenched and unclenched. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was angry that they hadn't worked yet. When another distant engine sound drifted from the woods, she reacted instantly. Her head snapped toward the tree line, and she moved without hesitation, stepping onto the lane itself like she meant to block it physically. Her arms swung out, pointing, claiming, daring whatever was coming to challenge her authority. The vehicle slowed but didn't stop this time. It crept forward, tires crunching softly, unwilling to retreat again. The tension spiked, sharp and electric. One of the people behind her shifted uneasily. The phone camera wobbled, and then, in a move that felt less like enforcement and more like a threat, she reached back toward the SUV and pulled something free from the open hatch, long, solid, wooden. A baseball bat. She held it not like a symbol, but like a solution. Like intimidation was the final rule she needed to enforce. The air changed instantly. What had been petty, bureaucratic harassment crossed into something else entirely. Something that couldn't be brushed off or ignored. Something that demanded a response not of anger, but of precision. I didn't shout. I didn't rush forward. I didn't give her the reaction she wanted. I turned, walked back into my house, and retrieved a thin folder I hadn't touched since closing day. Inside it was a single document copy I'd almost overlooked. The easement from 1923. As I stepped back onto the porch, the bat still raised, the lane still alive with history and use, I realized this dispute was no longer about HOA rules. It was about to become a lesson in what happens when paper authority meets real, recorded law. And the neighborhood was about to learn that some lines in the dirt are protected by 100 years of ink. The bat never swung, not that evening. It hovered in her hands like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence she thought she was finishing. The vehicle on the lane slowed to a crawl and then stopped, its presence alone enough to make the moment feel suspended in time. The other association members shifted uneasily, their confidence thinning as the situation drifted beyond the comfortable boundaries of rule enforcement and into something raw and unpredictable. This was no longer a checklist problem. This was a liability unfolding in real time. I stood on the porch with the folder in my hand, not raised, not hidden, just present. The paper inside it was thin, yellowed at the edges, and unremarkable to anyone who didn't know how to read between the lines of history. I didn't need to announce it. I didn't need to wave it like a flag. Its power came from the fact that it existed at all. While the bat represented impulse and intimidation, the document represented permanence. The woman's posture shifted when she noticed the folder. Her grip tightened reflexively, knuckles whitening around the bat, as if she sensed that something was slipping away from her. Control addicts are perceptive in that way. They feel threats before they understand them. The authority she'd been projecting suddenly looked fragile, dependent on everyone else believing the same story she did. The vehicle on the lane stayed put. No engine revving, no horn, just quiet insistence. Whoever sat inside knew this path, knew it well enough not to panic, knew that time was on their side, that calm was contagious. It seeped into the moment, draining the drama she was trying to manufacture. Eventually, she lowered the bat, not out of reason, but out of calculation. Cameras were still rolling. Witnesses were still watching. There was a line she couldn't cross without consequences. She couldn't spin away. She backed toward the SUV, eyes never leaving the folder, suspicion blooming into something closer to dread. The convoy retreated soon after, tires spinning gravel again, dust settling slowly like a curtain falling on a bad performance. That night, the neighborhood went quiet in a different way. Not the normal evening hush, but the kind that follows a disturbance. People talked behind doors. Text messages flew. Someone had crossed a line, and even those who liked strict rules didn't like the image of a bat raised on a neighbor's land. Fear has a way of rebalancing loyalties. I didn't sleep much. Instead, I spread the document across my kitchen table under a bright light and read it again, word by word. The easement wasn't flashy. It didn't shout. It described access, necessity, and continuity in language that assumed patience and permanence. It referenced parcels that no longer existed as such, land that had been divided and sold and renamed, but the access itself remained constant. A right-of-way established when horses were still common and cars were a novelty. It granted passage not to a person, but to the land itself, binding future owners whether they liked it or not. By morning, the first official response arrived. Not an apology, not a retraction, a notice of enforcement hearing. The association wanted me to appear before the board to address the violations. The tone was formal, legalistic, and deliberately intimidating. They believed the process itself was power. Show up alone, be outnumbered, be pressured into compliance. It was a ritual they had perfected. I accepted without comment. In the days leading up to the hearing, the pressure increased. More letters, more fines. The lane sign was reinforced, replaced with a sturdier post, sunk deeper into the ground, as if physical effort could compensate for legal weakness. Someone trimmed brush along the path aggressively, not to clear it for use, but to make a statement of possession. Each action was documented, photographed, and logged. The association was building its case with confidence. They had no idea they were also building mine. The hearing took place in a rented community room decorated with motivational posters and folding chairs. The board sat at a long table, elevated slightly, like a panel of minor judges. The woman sat among them, no longer carrying a bat, but radiating the same hostility through posture alone. Her eyes tracked me as I took my seat, cataloging every movement, every expression. She expected defensiveness. She expected pleading. She got neither. The association laid out its case methodically: the unauthorized access, the alleged danger, the claim that the lane constituted trespassing on common land, despite being nowhere near any officially designated common area. They cited bylaws adopted decades after the easement was recorded, rules written as if history began the day the neighborhood was founded. The woman nodded along vigorously, reinforcing each point with body language that said certainty was enough. When it was my turn, I didn't argue. I didn't counter their interpretations or question their motives. I placed the document on the table and slid copies toward each board member. The paper didn't look impressive. No glossy cover, no modern formatting, just dense text and a recording stamp that predated all of them. The room changed almost immediately. People leaned forward. Pages were flipped. The casual confidence evaporated, replaced by the slow realization that they were reading something outside their control. One board member frowned, tracing a line with a finger. Another whispered to the person beside them. The woman's expression tightened, then hardened, then flickered with something like panic. She hadn't expected this. She'd expected compliance or resistance, not history. The easement didn't need defending. It explained itself. It described the lane exactly as it existed, the purpose it served, and the permanence of that purpose. It didn't care about association rules or modern sensibilities. It cared about continuity. The board recessed briefly, retreating into a huddle that looked far less authoritative up close. Voices dropped. Gestures became sharp. The woman's participation grew frantic, her hands moving faster, her posture leaning in too far, like she could will the document into irrelevance through sheer force of personality. When they returned, the tone had shifted. No longer aggressive, cautious. They acknowledged the existence of the easement, though they tried to frame it as under review. They postponed enforcement pending legal consultation. Fines were suspended, though not yet removed. The sign would remain for now. The lane's status was unclear. It was a retreat disguised as neutrality. Outside, the woman confronted me without words, her stare burning with humiliation and resentment. This wasn't over for her. People like this don't accept being wrong. They reinterpret it as sabotage. In her mind, I hadn't defended my rights. I'd undermined her authority. That afternoon, the lane saw more traffic than it had in days. News travels fast when something ancient reasserts itself. The drivers moved with renewed confidence, less hesitant now that the threat had been exposed as hollow. Each tire track pressed history a little deeper into the ground. I stood at the edge of my property, watching the sun dip low, the path glowing softly in the fading light. The easement wasn't just a legal tool anymore, it was a fault line, and the pressure building around it promised something more dramatic ahead. The association had underestimated the weight of old ink, and the woman with the bat had no idea how much harder history could hit when it finally swung back. The pause the board declared did not calm the neighborhood. It energized it. Uncertainty spread faster than clarity ever could, and in that gap between what had been assumed and what had been revealed, people began choosing sides. Some leaned into denial, insisting the association would sort it out and restore order. Others, quieter but more attentive, started asking questions they'd never dared to ask before, about boundaries, about rights, about how many other rules rested on shaky ground. The woman did not retreat. She regrouped. Within days, the lane became a battleground of passive aggression. New notices appeared, this time carefully worded to avoid directly challenging the easement while still making its use as uncomfortable as possible. Warnings about speed, about noise, about environmental impact. None of them referenced ownership. All of them implied scrutiny. Cameras were installed on nearby homes, angled just far enough to suggest monitoring without openly admitting it. The message was clear. If they couldn't block the lane outright, they would make using it feel risky. I documented everything, not just the obvious moves, but the subtle ones. The way association vehicles idled near my property longer than necessary. The way board members suddenly took interest in my fence line, my trash bins, my porch light. Enforcement became selective, focused, personal. It was harassment wrapped in procedure. The woman spearheaded it all. Her presence became constant. If a notice went out, her name was attached. If a camera appeared, it faced my direction. She walked the edge of the lane daily, clipboard in hand, inspecting the dirt like she expected it to confess something incriminating. The humiliation of the hearing hadn't taught her caution. It had sharpened her obsession. The first real test came when a delivery truck used the lane mid-morning, its weight deepening the tracks, its engine loud enough to attract attention. Within minutes, an association vehicle arrived, lights flashing not in emergency but in performance. The driver positioned the car to partially block the exit, forcing the truck to stop. From my porch, I watched the woman stride forward, posture rigid, confidence overcompensated. She didn't have a bat this time, she had something else. Paper, notices, forms meant to intimidate through repetition. The driver remained in his seat, patient, unmoved, the delay stretched. Neighbors gathered at a distance, drawn by the spectacle. Cameras came out again. Eventually, the truck moved on, the lane reclaiming its quiet. The association vehicle followed, its presence lingering just long enough to remind everyone that this wasn't finished. That afternoon, I received a letter from the association's attorney. The tone was different from the board's, polite, measured, concerned. It acknowledged the easement but questioned its scope, suggesting that while access might be permitted, the frequency and type of use could be subject to reasonable regulation. It was an attempt to shrink something expansive into something manageable. To tame history with modern language, I forwarded the letter to my own attorney, a man who had built his career on property disputes that everyone else thought were settled. His response was short and decisive. Old easements do not negotiate. They either exist or they don't, and this one existed loudly. The woman, apparently unaware that lawyers were now involved, escalated again. One evening, under cover of dusk, the lane markers were moved. Not removed entirely, but shifted just enough to narrow the path. Stakes repositioned, brush piled closer. The effect was subtle but dangerous. Anyone unfamiliar with the lane could be forced off course, risking damage or worse. It was sabotage disguised as landscaping. I discovered it the next morning and felt something tighten that had nothing to do with anger. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was reckless. Someone could get hurt. And if they did, the blame would be scattered, diluted, denied. I restored nothing. Instead, I photographed the changes and contacted my attorney again. This time, his reply carried weight. If the association interfered with a recorded easement, knowingly and intentionally, the consequences could be severe. Injunctions, damages, personal liability for board members who acted outside their authority. Personal liability, that phrase has a way of cutting through bravado. Formal letters went out the next day, addressed not just to the association, but to individual board members by name. They detailed the easement's history, its legal protections, and the risks of continued interference. The tone was professional, not threatening, but the message was unmistakable. This was no longer a neighbor dispute. It was a legal boundary, and crossing it came at a cost. The board responded with silence. The woman did not. She showed up at my property again, alone this time just after sunset. No clipboard, no entourage. Her SUV parked at the edge of the drive, engine off. She stood near the lane, arms crossed, staring at the ground like she was memorizing it. I watched from a distance, unwilling to feed the moment but unwilling to ignore it. She bent down and picked up one of the old stones that marked the lane's edge, a piece of history half, buried and smoothed by decades of use. She turned it over in her hands, examining it like evidence. Then she hurled it into the brush with sudden force. It was a small act, but it spoke volumes. The next morning, the association finally replied. They agreed to remove the sign and the flags temporarily. They insisted it was a gesture of goodwill, not an admission. They requested mediation. The lane was cleared by noon. The dirt looked wider, freer, as if relieved to be acknowledged again. Traffic resumed, cautious but steady. The neighborhood watched, recalibrating its assumptions. I knew it wasn't over. People like her don't accept mediation when they believe they've lost control. They look for another lever, another angle, another way to punish, and somewhere between the removal of the signs and the quiet that followed, I sensed the next escalation wouldn't come on paper or through procedure. It would come through spite. The easement had survived a century of change. Now it was testing whether the people around it could survive their own need to dominate. The removal of the signs didn't bring relief so much as it brought a false calm, the kind that settles in right before something breaks. The lane looked almost innocent again, a quiet strip of dirt threading through the trees, but the tension around it had thickened. People no longer pretended not to see it. Every vehicle that passed carried a sense of defiance. Every set of tire tracks a reminder that the association's authority had limits. That kind of reminder is intoxicating to some and infuriating to others. The woman fell squarely into the second category. Her strategy shifted. When rules and paperwork failed, she stopped trying to dominate the land and started targeting the person attached to it. Inspections appeared for things no one had ever cared about before. The angle of my trash bin, the timing of lawn maintenance, the placement of outdoor furniture. Each violation was minor, forgettable on its own, but together they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. It was a campaign designed to exhaust, to remind me that even if she couldn't take the lane, she could still make my life uncomfortable. Neighbors noticed. Some sympathized quietly, offering small nods or halves, miles when we crossed paths. Others avoided eye contact entirely, afraid that association with me might put them next in line. Fear works that way. It isolates its target by making everyone else grateful they aren't chosen. The woman leaned into that fear. She walked the neighborhood with renewed purpose, stopping to talk just long enough to plant ideas, safety concerns, liability worries, the suggestion that allowing old access rights threatened property values. None of it was backed by fact, but repetition gave it weight. She didn't need everyone to agree with her. She only needed enough people to doubt me. Then came the complaint that crossed from nuisance into provocation. One morning, an association notice arrived claiming that I had threatened board members. No details, no dates, just an allegation, vague and serious enough to imply consequences. It was a calculated move. By framing herself as the victim, she hoped to rewrite the narrative of the bat, the harassment, the intimidation. Accusations don't need proof to cause damage. They only need to exist long enough to be believed by the wrong person. I responded the same way I had from the beginning, calm, documented, precise. My attorney advised me to do nothing publicly, to let the pattern speak for itself. False accusations collapse under their own weight when exposed to records, timelines, and witnesses. The woman, however, was not patient. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the lane, she appeared again at the back of my property. This time, she didn't stay near the edge. She stepped fully onto the path, standing in the center as if daring it to move around her. A vehicle approached from the woods and slowed, uncertainty rippling through the moment. She raised her arms, not violently but theatrically, signaling stop. From my vantage point, I could see the tension coil. This wasn't enforcement. It was confrontation. She was inserting herself into a situation she had no authority to control, relying on presence and intimidation instead of law. The vehicle stopped, engine idling, the driver unseen. She stood there longer than necessary, savoring the power of being an obstacle. Then she stepped aside, letting the vehicle pass with exaggerated reluctance, her head shaking in visible disapproval. It was performance art for an audience of one, but that audience mattered. It was meant to unsettle the people who relied on that lane. I filmed the entire thing from a distance, not because I needed proof anymore, but because the story was changing shape. This was no longer just about an easement. It was about behavior, about someone who believed inconvenience justified interference, and authority justified intimidation. That night, word spread that the association planned a special meeting. Not a mediation, not a discussion, a vote. The agenda, leaked through whispers and speculation, centered on emergency measures to address the lane. The phrase alone suggested urgency manufactured for effect. I received the notice the next morning. Mandatory attendance requested. The wording implied consequences for absence, another attempt to box me into their process. I agreed to attend, though by now I understood the meeting wasn't meant to resolve anything. It was meant to reassert dominance in a public forum. The room was fuller than before. Residents filled the chairs, curiosity and anxiety mingling in the air. The board looked strained, their confidence eroded by weeks of uncertainty and legal pressure. The woman sat rigidly among them, jaw set, eyes scanning the room like she was counting allies. The presentation focused on fear, slides about accidents, hypothetical risks, vague references to unauthorized individuals using the lane. The easement was mentioned only briefly, framed as outdated, inconvenient, something that needed modern interpretation. History was treated like a flaw to be corrected. Then the woman took center stage. Not officially, but effectively. Her body language dominated the room, her gestures sharp and emphatic. She didn't need to speak for her message to land. She wanted the neighborhood to choose order over rights, comfort over law. She wanted them to believe that control equaled safety. When the vote was called, it wasn't binding. They didn't have the authority to nullify the easement, and everyone knew it. But the symbolic gesture mattered to her. She needed a show of support, a moment where the room leaned her way. The result was split, not the overwhelming validation she'd expected, enough dissent to sting, enough hesitation to undermine her certainty. After the meeting, the mood shifted again. The woman's presence became sharper, less controlled. Where before she had relied on procedure, now she relied on proximity. She parked near my house more often. She lingered at the edge of the lane longer. Her stares grew longer, heavier, as if she were trying to intimidate through sheer persistence. The pressure culminated one evening when I returned home to find my driveway partially blocked by association cones. No notice, no explanation, just an obstacle placed to inconvenience and provoke. I documented it, removed nothing, and contacted my attorney. This time, his response carried finality. The pattern of behavior, the documented interference, the personal targeting, all of it pointed toward a single conclusion. The association and potentially individual members were exposing themselves to serious legal consequences. Injunctive relief was no longer a possibility. It was becoming a necessity. Papers were drafted, motions prepared. The law, slow and patient, was beginning to rise. The woman didn't know it yet, but her efforts to regain control had pushed the situation past the point of neighborhood politics. She had turned a property dispute into a personal vendetta, and in doing so, she had stripped herself of the protection anonymity provides. The lane remained open. The easement remained unchallenged in law, and the weight of what she'd set in motion was about to fall, not on the land, but squarely on her. The papers were filed quietly, without announcement or spectacle, the way serious things usually are. There was no dramatic reveal, no warning shot across the bow. One day the pressure was abstract, simmering beneath the surface, and the next it had a docket number and a courthouse attached to it. The association did not receive it as a community matter. It arrived addressed in legal language, formal and impersonal, naming actions, behaviors, and dates with a precision that stripped away spin. What had once been framed as rule enforcement was now described as interference, harassment, and obstruction of a recorded right. The shift was immediate, though not uniform. Some board members panicked silently, their confidence collapsing under the realization that bylaws and laminated handbooks offered no shield against state law. Others doubled down in private, clinging to the belief that the association's influence would carry weight simply because it always had. The woman fell into the latter group, at least at first. She continued her routines, her patrols, her watchful presence at the lane, as if repetition could overwrite the reality that the situation had moved beyond her control. The injunction request hit hardest. It didn't argue, it didn't insult. It simply laid out facts and asked the court to stop the interference immediately. No more signs, no more obstacles, no more intimidation, direct or indirect. It named the association, but it also named individuals whose actions had crossed from governance into personal misconduct. Names matter in filings. They turn collective arrogance into individual risk. When the court granted the temporary order, the effect rippled through the neighborhood like a low thunderclap. Association vehicles disappeared almost overnight. The cones vanished. The lingering inspections stopped. Cameras that had been carefully angled toward my property were suddenly adjusted or removed altogether. The lane, for the first time since I'd moved in, existed without commentary. The woman reacted poorly to the sudden vacuum of authority. Without her usual tools, her presence became erratic. She appeared and disappeared unpredictably, sometimes watching from a distance, sometimes absent for days. The performance had lost its audience, and without reinforcement, her certainty began to fray. Official notices followed, cease and desist letters, stern and unambiguous, arrived at individual addresses. They outlined potential consequences in language that left little room for interpretation. Fines, contempt, personal liability. The association's attorney, now fully engaged, urged compliance and restraint. The board, chastened, issued a carefully worded statement urging calm and cooperation. It was the closest thing to an admission they were willing to make. The woman did not sign on to the new tone. She attended fewer meetings, avoided public spaces where she might be questioned, and withdrew into a tight orbit of like-minded supporters. Her anger didn't dissipate, it condensed. Where before it had spilled outward in constant activity, now it simmered, focused, waiting for an opening. The court date loomed, and with it the possibility of something far more damaging than embarrassment. Depositions were scheduled, records requested, emails, texts, internal communications. The association's inner workings, once shielded by informality and mutual trust, were about to be examined under oath. The first cracks appeared when neighbors began receiving calls, not from me, but from attorneys. Simple questions at first: who had placed the signs, who had instructed the vehicles to block the lane, who had authorized the notices. The answers varied, hesitant and inconsistent, revealing a truth no one wanted to acknowledge. Much of what had happened had been driven not by formal votes or clear authority, but by assumption. By one person acting as if permission were implicit. That realization spread quietly, eroding alliances. People who had once nodded along began distancing themselves. Silence replaced solidarity. The woman's circle shrank, not because anyone confronted her directly, but because risk has a way of clarifying loyalty. One afternoon, I returned home to find a deputy parked near the lane, not responding to an emergency. Just present. The court order had shifted responsibility outward. Interference was no longer an internal matter. It was enforceable. The deputy acknowledged the easement with a brief glance at the paperwork and left without incident. The message lingered long after the vehicle was gone. The woman saw it too. From a distance, from behind the safety of her car, she watched the quiet assertion of lawful authority replace her own. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It didn't need to be. In the days that followed, the association's tone softened further. Mediation was suggested again, this time without threats or deadlines. The offer felt less like negotiation and more like retreat. The lane remained untouched. The path widened naturally as use resumed, history reinforcing itself through repetition. The court filings continued to build, layer upon layer of documentation stretching back nearly a century. The easement's origins were traced, its continuity established. Each page added weight to a truth that no amount of local outrage could dislodge. The woman, cornered by reality and stripped of her informal power, began to unravel. Her appearances became rare, her confidence brittle. When she did surface, it was with a sharpness that felt desperate rather than commanding. The neighborhood sensed it, the way animals sense weakness. The law had arrived, not with a shout, but with a steady, undeniable presence. And as it settled in, it became clear that the dispute was no longer about whether the easement existed. That question had been answered. What remained was whether the woman could accept a world where she no longer decided who was allowed to pass. The closer the court date came, the heavier everything felt, as if the neighborhood itself were holding its breath. The lane, once an unremarkable feature of the landscape, had become a symbol. People slowed when they drove it now, not out of fear, but awareness. Each pass was a quiet assertion that history still mattered, that rights recorded in ink could not be erased by committee votes or personal vendettas. The association's internal fractures widened. Board members who had once spoken confidently about community standards now chose their words carefully, aware that anything written or said could surface later under oath. Meetings grew shorter, agendas thinner. Items that once sparked heated debate were deferred indefinitely. The machinery of enforcement, once loud and relentless, ground down to a hesitant crawl. The woman, however, refused to adapt. Where others retreated into caution, she leaned into defiance. She sent emails to neighbors warning of impending danger, framing the lane as a threat that the court simply didn't understand. She circulated selective interpretations of bylaws, ignoring the injunction as if it were a suggestion rather than an order. Her tone grew sharper, more conspiratorial, as if rallying a dwindling audience against an invisible enemy. That defiance soon met reality. A process server arrived one afternoon, walking up her driveway with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. The papers were handed over without drama, but the effect was immediate. The lawsuit no longer existed in abstract filings or community rumors. It had her name on it, specific actions, specific dates, specific consequences. Depositions followed quickly. The association's attorney, clearly uneasy, prepared the board for scrutiny they had never experienced. They were instructed to answer truthfully, to speculate less, to defer when uncertain. The woman attended these preparations with visible frustration, chafing at the restraints imposed by legal counsel. She had never operated well within limits, and now limits surrounded her on all sides. The first deposition sent shockwaves through the community. A board member, under oath, acknowledged that no formal vote had authorized the placement of the signs or the physical interference with the lane. Another admitted that much of the enforcement activity had been driven by assumptions, rather than documented authority. The word assumption echoed loudly, stripping legitimacy from months of aggressive action. As transcripts circulated among attorneys, the woman's role became increasingly clear. Emails surfaced showing her directives, her insistence on urgency, her framing of the lane as a personal affront. Language that had once seemed passionate now read as reckless. The pattern was undeniable. Neighbors began to distance themselves more openly. Conversations ended abruptly when she approached. Invitations dried up. People who had once supported strict enforcement now spoke cautiously about going too far. The social isolation she had once weaponized against others now turned inward, enclosing her. The injunction was tested for the first time when she violated it. Not dramatically, but deliberately. One morning, a temporary barrier appeared near the lane, placed just close enough to be ambiguous, just far enough to claim misunderstanding. It didn't last long. A photograph, a timestamp, and a call to counsel were all it took. The response was swift. A warning from the court, formal and unambiguous, made it clear that further violations would not be tolerated. The tone left no doubt. The consequences would escalate. That warning changed everything. The association's leadership moved decisively, not out of solidarity, but self-preservation. They issued a directive prohibiting any board member from acting independently regarding the lane. They appointed a liaison to handle all communication with legal counsel. They removed the woman from any role that gave her direct influence over enforcement, framing it as a temporary measure while the case proceeded. She did not take it quietly. Her anger spilled into public view, no longer filtered through procedure or authority. She complained loudly about betrayal, about weakness, about a community that had lost its backbone. The outbursts only confirmed what many had begun to suspect. The issue had never truly been about safety or rules. It had been about control. The court date arrived without fanfare. There were no news cameras, no crowds, just attorneys, documents, and a judge with little patience for theatrics. The arguments were concise. The facts were clear. The easement stood unchallenged. The interference was documented. The injunction was upheld and extended. The judge's remarks were measured but pointed, emphasizing the seriousness of ignoring recorded property rights and the dangers of substituting personal judgment for legal authority. It was a rebuke delivered without raising a voice, and it carried more weight than any confrontation ever could. For the woman, it was devastating. The ruling stripped away the last illusion that she could outlast the process. The law had not only recognized the easement, it had protected it. In the aftermath, the neighborhood shifted again. The lane was no longer controversial. It was settled. Attention turned elsewhere, to other grievances, other distractions. Life moved on. The woman did not. Her reputation, once built on certainty and enforcement, now rested on defiance and consequence. The cost of her refusal to yield had become visible to everyone, etched into court orders and community memory. And as the dust settled, one truth stood clear. Control, when clung to too tightly, does not preserve authority. It destroys it. After the ruling, the neighborhood entered an unfamiliar phase, reflection. With the lane dispute settled in law, attention shifted from the land to the people who had tried to claim it. Conversations that had once been whispered now surfaced openly, often in small clusters near mailboxes or during slow evening walks. People compared notes, revisited old grievances, and began to recognize patterns they had previously dismissed as isolated incidents. The easement had not created the conflict, it had exposed it. The association scrambled to stabilize its image. A new statement went out, carefully crafted, emphasizing respect for property rights and cooperation with the court. It framed recent events as a misunderstanding rather than a systemic failure, but the tone rang hollow to those who had watched enforcement mutate into intimidation. Trust, once cracked, does not repair easily with generic language. Internal changes followed, committees were restructured, oversight procedures were announced, new checks were promised to prevent individual board members from acting unilaterally. On paper, it all looked responsible. In practice, it was damage control. The association wasn't evolving. It was retreating from exposure. The woman became the unspoken center of these discussions. No one named her directly at first, but everyone knew who the cautionary example was. Stories surfaced about prior encounters, moments when her certainty had overridden common sense, when rules had been wielded selectively to punish rather than guide. The lane had simply been the first time someone refused to yield. She reacted to the shift with bitterness. Without formal authority, she attempted to maintain influence socially, warning neighbors that the ruling set a dangerous precedent, that outsiders could now challenge community standards. The language echoed her earlier rhetoric, but it landed differently now. The audience was thinner, less receptive. Fear had lost its grip. Some residents began questioning other rules. Not rejecting them outright, but asking where they came from, how they were enforced, and who benefited most from their strictest interpretations. The association's power, once taken for granted, became subject to scrutiny. The lane had opened more than a path through the woods. It had opened a conversation. The woman's isolation deepened. Invitations to community events dwindled. Her presence at meetings grew tense. Her comments met with polite but firm resistance. When she spoke, people listened out of habit, not agreement. Authority without consent is a fragile thing. Meanwhile, the lane returned to its quiet rhythm. Vehicles passed without incident. The dirt settled into familiar grooves. Grass edged the sides gently, reclaiming its place without erasing the path. The easement functioned as it always had, indifferent to the drama it had caused. History, once acknowledged, rarely needs defending. The association, facing rising legal costs and internal dissent, quietly sought to resolve remaining issues. Settlements were discussed. Insurance carriers asked uncomfortable questions. Risk assessments were revised. The days of casual enforcement were over. The woman, feeling cornered, lashed out in smaller ways. Complaints filed and withdrawn. Letters drafted and never sent. Her energy had nowhere productive to go. Without an outlet for control, it turned inward, manifesting as frustration and resentment. One evening, a neighbor stopped me during a walk, not to apologize or take sides, but to thank me for standing firm. For forcing a reckoning, the moment was brief, understated, but meaningful. It confirmed what I had suspected all along. Many had felt constrained by the same overreach. They just hadn't known how to push back. The association announced upcoming elections, a routine event that suddenly carried weight. New candidates emerged, campaigning on transparency and restraint. The tone was cautious but hopeful. Change, once unthinkable, now seemed possible. The woman did not run. Whether by choice or necessity, she stayed on the sidelines, watching the structure she had once dominated begin to reshape itself without her. The loss of influence was more cutting than any legal consequence. As summer edged toward fall, the neighborhood settled into a new normal, one defined less by rigid enforcement and more by awareness. The lane remained open, the easement remained intact, and the community, though not healed, was learning. The reckoning had come quietly, not with shouting or spectacle, but with the slow realization that unchecked control carries a cost, and that cost, once paid, changes everything. Time has a way of sanding down the sharp edges of conflict, but it never erases the shape of what happened. By the time autumn settled in, the lane no longer drew stares or whispers. It existed as it always had, a simple fact of the land, accepted again after a brief, turbulent denial. What lingered wasn't tension, but memory. People remembered how quickly authority had turned aggressive, how easily rules had been used as weapons when no one pushed back. That memory became the lane's true legacy. The association elections confirmed the shift. New board members took seats, cautious and visibly aware of the scrutiny that now followed the role. Their language was careful, their promises modest. They spoke less about control and more about balance, less about enforcement and more about clarity. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was different, and in communities like this, difference matters. The woman faded from prominence. She remained physically present, still living in the neighborhood, still walking the same streets, but her influence was gone. People no longer deferred to her interpretations or sought her approval. Conversations stopped when she approached, not out of fear, but disinterest. Power, once lost, does not linger in the air. It leaves a vacuum that quickly fills with something else. The legal case wound down quietly. Settlements were reached, conditions agreed upon. The injunction stood as a permanent reminder of boundaries crossed and corrected. No apologies were issued publicly. None were needed. The record spoke for itself. Occasionally, someone new would move into the neighborhood and ask about the lane. The story would be told in fragments, softened by time but clear in its lesson. About an easement older than the houses. About a dispute that went too far. About the day the law reminded everyone that authority has limits. I continued living my life, tending to the property, walking the land, respecting the path that had existed long before I arrived and would remain long after I was gone. The easement no longer felt like a weapon or a shield. It felt like what it had always been, a quiet agreement between generations. The woman, for her part, carried the weight of what she'd lost. Reputation is a currency that doesn't replenish easily once spent. Her certainty, once her defining trait, now read as stubbornness. Her warnings sounded hollow. The community moved around her, not against her, but without her. The lane endured. That was the final truth. It didn't celebrate victory. It didn't mark defeat. It simply existed, unchanged by the drama layered briefly on top of it. The land remembered what people tried to forget, and in that quiet persistence, there was something profoundly grounding. A reminder that not all power is loud. Some of it is written in old ink, buried in records, waiting patiently for the moment it is needed. By winter, the story had lost its heat, not because it had been forgotten, but because it no longer needed retelling. The lane was just the lane again. The association was just an association, smaller in spirit, more cautious in reach. The woman was just another resident, stripped of the authority she once wore like armor. Life resumed its ordinary patterns, altered subtly but permanently by what had unfolded. The quiet that followed felt earned. It wasn't the silence of avoidance or suppression, but the calm that comes after a boundary has been clearly drawn and respected. People went about their routines with a new awareness, an understanding that rules were not immutable truths, and authority was not absolute simply because it spoke loudly. The easement remained in the county records, unchanged, its language still describing access and necessity as it had nearly a century before. It had outlasted outrage, intimidation, and fear. It would outlast everyone involved. There was comfort in that permanence, in knowing that some things are too deeply rooted to be bullied into submission. Occasionally, I would see her watching from a distance, her expression unreadable. There was no triumph in those moments, no satisfaction. Only the quiet acknowledgement that choices have consequences, and those consequences ripple outward long after the moment of decision has passed. The neighborhood had learned, not through lectures or slogans, but through experience. It had seen how quickly control could turn corrosive, and how fragile authority becomes when it forgets its limits. The lesson lingered, shaping interactions in ways too subtle to measure, but too important to ignore. I never closed the lane, never fenced it off or marked it as mine alone. That was never the point. The easement existed to allow passage, not to prove ownership. Respecting it meant understanding that the land carried obligations as well as rights. In the end, nothing dramatic remained, no shouting matches, no raised bats, no emergency meetings, just a stretch of earth worn smooth by time, continuing to serve its purpose without comment, and that was enough.